Um, Normally between or at the end of December, I intentionally spend some time doing some reflecting, and so then normally my teaching time is after Christmas is more devotional than teaching, and today is going to be like that. And to be honest, I'm nervous. Going to be a little vulnerable today, and just am. I want to start with a passage from Matthew 7. So Matthew 7:24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and yet it did not fall because its foundation had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. I've always looked at that as kind of a split-screen movie where there's one rainstorm and you have the foolish guy and you have the wise guy. And this rainstorm, and on this split screen of the movie, you have this rainstorm and one house is collapsing in the midst of this and one house is staying stable. And Cam Robinson and I were going for breakfast one time, and he says to me, I remember watching a cartoon, and it was actually one guy experiencing both of these. That he had, in an earlier period of his life, had built a house on sand, and it washed away, and then later on built it on a rock, and it was a firm foundation. And I came to realize very clearly that when he had said that he was describing me and what I had walked through. 2 years ago, I went through a period of spiritual deconstruction, and it was incredibly stressful. And it was this split-screen movie is what I'll get you to put that up, Demira. So I have my phone number on there because as I'm going along, if I want to give an opportunity for response or questions or wanting clarity, I also recognize that this is a subject that people may not want to jump up and down and say, I'm in the midst of this. And so this is my cell number, and as I'm going along, if you send me a text, then I won't use your name, but I'll include this as part of what I'm doing because I want to give opportunity for that. So that's why my cell number is on there. Almost everyone I talk to who's been through this recognizes that this is not something they plan to do. This is like, I'm going to deconstruct on Tuesday. It's not something that's planned. What ends up happening is they realize after they've been through it or in the midst of the manure pile or the mud pile that they're in, they're going, I'm deconstructing. And that's what happened to me as well. And that's actually, I'm finding most of the time that's what people have happen. And what I found is that as I've listened to people and walked through this with them, these two houses are a way of giving some language. And that's what I hope to do, because today might not be for everybody. Some of you may think, like, why in the world are you doing this, Tony? For others, this may be life-giving because I'm giving language to something that you've not had language for before. And so that's what I hope to do today. What is deconstruction? It's a time of intense evaluation of beliefs and assumptions. It's a time of questioning and a time of doubt, where you break down your beliefs in a desire to see what's actually true. And so that's where the deconstructing, it's tearing the building down to the studs. It's a time of testing the assumptions that you've made over decades to see if they're actually worthy of holding. Is this still good for me to hold on to? Scott McKnight has been one of my guides, not personally, but through his writing. And this is what he says. Deconstruction separates items in the religious pot. It saves what's redeemable. It tosses out what's irredeemable. These pertain to beliefs, actions, and relationships. Deconstruction in this sense requires cognitive or thinking shifts, learning to make new meaning out of one's life, comprehending authority and power structures and systems, and perceiving how the trauma has lived its way out in us. Anyone going through deconstruction is in pain and is in a liminal state. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Because both of these houses, when I first did this, these houses were close together. And I realized that I needed to separate them because there's actually a lot of time between the deconstruction of one and the rebuilding of the other. They don't happen like right next to each other. There's time in between. I'm going to talk about that. And that space in between is a liminal space. And if you don't understand what the word liminal means, I'll explain in a bit. They need to be respected and listened to. No one enters into such a massive, pervasive shift in life haphazardly, recklessly, or lightheartedly. This is why deconstructionists deserve our respect. They deserve to be heard. There's a prophetic voice at work in deconstruction. Anderson contends that one of the telltale marks of healing, or the process of healing, is the adventure of curiosity. As she says it, something new is unnatural to the way of our thinking, but healing will require exploring new curiosities. Curiosity is an invitation out of our old patterns, habits, and familiar thoughts and behaviors. Practicing curiosity flies in the face of a fundamentalist binary thinking because it recognizes multiple realities can exist before us. And I'd have to really affirm that curiosity, and that's become one of my indicators of health is curiosity. So 2 summers ago, I was reading through Matthew, and Matthew 12:20 became really a touchstone to start this whole process for me. And it's one that I've used before here. And so in Matthew 12, starting in verse 15, Jesus is meeting with a group, and he's reading from Isaiah. So this is a prophecy of Jesus, and it's essentially Jesus' call as given by the prophet Isaiah. So verse 17, this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love and whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. And verse 20 here was the one that just nailed me between the eyes and changed my world. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he's brought justice through to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. This is how Jesus works. The bruised reed is broken. It's a reed is a tender thing as it is. This is not just something that's tender, but bruised. This tender thing is bruised. And it will not take much for this bruised reed to be completely dismantled and destroyed. And the wick that is smoldering and just barely alive will not take much for a brief breath for it to go out. And as Jesus interacts with people, it is the bruised, It is the smoldering. It's the barely hanging on people that he sees. And not only sees, he respects and he honors. He is not cruel. He's not mean. He does not destroy. Most people that I talk to about deconstruction, almost every, and I don't have a huge sample size here, but as I've run this by Phil Gunther, as I've run this by other pastor friends of mine, they agree that most deconstruction actually follows a traumatic event, where they've oftentimes been a bruised reed that's been broken. There's a smoldering wick that gets snuffed out, where they find themselves being bruised or broken in that way. It was right after going through this that I started to listen to a podcast called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill by Christianity Today, and it was about Mark Driscoll. And for those unfamiliar with it, it was an investigative podcast, I think 12, 15 episodes long, that went into this mega church in Seattle that rose quickly, and then within weeks was like 15,000 people in the church done within weeks. How did this happen? What went on there? As I was listening to this podcast, it was like a mirror of my life. The evangelical background that Mark Driscoll grew up in was mine. And I saw myself in this podcast, and it was disgusting. I was horrified by what I was seeing. To give a little context of what Driscoll was like, one of the quotes, and I'm only going to read, there's a lot of stuff that he says that I'm going through and I'm going, I can't say this, I can't say this, I can't say this. I would not say in public, the language and the other things, it's just not. But in this one part, Mark Driscoll was bristling against the authority of the elders, and he didn't like the way that there were some limitations on him. And so they had a meeting about it, and on the Sunday morning, addressing the body, is what Driscoll said, "There's a pile of dead bodies behind the Mars Hill bus. By God's grace, it'll be a mountain by the time we're done." The next day, he fired all the elders that were disagreeing with him. There's a pile of dead bodies behind the Mars Hill bus. By God's grace, it'll be a mountain before I'm done. That is not Matthew 12:20. How can your purpose be to destroy lives as a church? It's repulsive. It's disgusting. It's totally contrary to what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 12:20 and throughout Scripture. What was interesting is I knew some of the characters in this. When I was on the national executive, our church planning arm of our conference was based out of Vancouver. And they were in constant contact with Driscoll when he was leading an international church planning program. And they were like him. And there's a reason they're not with us in our conference today. Because they're not good people. And I remember the meeting, the national meeting that we were at, where this was confronted. And only one of the 5 or 6 guys who are leading this church planting thing in Canada were there to own up to what they did. And I remember visiting, Bruce Enns and I he was walking through this podcast and with this stuff at the same time as I was. He was chair of our national executive at the time. I remember going visiting him when he was still at Forest Grove. And we're talking about these characters that we knew and the way that they were going. I said, where were they? Where were they? They needed to own this. Where's Gord? Texted him after. I'm going to be reading from portions of my journal over today, and so this was part of that. We were talking about Driscoll, and I said, this podcast has been part of my own deconstruction and reconstruction as a follower of Jesus. Questioning the cultural values I grew up with and filtering out the ones I now see don't really fit Jesus as fully as I thought. My beliefs have not changed much, but my posture and focus has. Though it's much more than that, and I can't quite describe it. David Fitch said that we use worldly means to accomplish divine purposes, specifically naming manipulation, dominance, and control as negative uses of power. In my coaching and leadership, I've decided not to play the game that way and choose to enter into the fray with different rules than earthly ones, beatitude rules, not breaking bruised reed rules. You can hear that kind of the foreshadowing of the beatitude stuff there that started through 2 years later. Thanks for your friendship. I never anticipated how close to home this podcast would hit and how much it would be a part of my internal changes. In the aftermath, as I was describing my deconstruction to people, the what I believed about or who God is didn't change. What I believed didn't change, but the how really did. How do I treat people? And I can't be a jerk, because Jesus was not a jerk. And too often, we're jerks as churches and as pastors, as leaders. I began to see that the evangelical tribe that I grew up in was choosing political means for changing the culture rather than discipleship. Using power. From November 27th to 21. I was reading in Ezekiel 9. While they were killing and I was left alone, I fell face down crying, "Alas, sovereign Lord, are you going to destroy the entire remnant of Israel in this outpouring of your wrath upon Jerusalem?" He answered me, "The sin of the people of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of bloodshed and the city is full of injustice. They say the Lord's forsaken the land, the Lord does not see. So I will not look down with them with pity and spare them, but bring down on them their own heads what they have done." In my notes, in my reflections on that day, the land is full of bloodshed, the city's full of injustice. As I read Scott McKnight's post today about the myriad of stories exposing abuse and cover-up in pastors, and it's not stopped. As I read my fictional detective stories, it is interesting how fiction can describe to us and become a mirror to us. And I hadn't really noticed till this point, but church leaders are always hypocrites in these fictional stories. The nuns are always harsh and soulless. The pastors and priests are emphasizing judgment and law instead of grace. This is how our culture has experienced religion and the church. No wonder there is a desire for something different. We are reaping what we have sown. Legalism and judgment and anger and retribution and control and power. Things need to change. We're crushing bruised reeds and smothering smoldering wicks in our midst. How do I do things differently? Romans 12:2 from that same day. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. We have for too long, my own notes, we have for too long used the methods of this world to seek to accomplish divine goals. I need to review the Beatitudes and Sermon on the Mount again in the Kingdom of God, parables in Romans 12. We are messy people on a long journey of discipleship. We are incomplete and immature followers of you. I began to watch my heroes, Rabbi Zacharias, Bill Hybels, fall. Spiritual leaders using political means. When I grew up politically in the 90s, in my early 20s, and I watched the Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky part was part of my political growing up, and how I watched our evangelical leaders say that Bill Clinton cannot be followed because he is not of good character. And years of this whole, he was 2 terms, and for 8 years, that's what I heard over and over. And then these same people say that Trump's fine. And I don't get it. Because he's worse. And I don't say that lightly, because I don't have high regard for Bill Clinton. And yet, Trump's worse. And yet, it's okay. What's wrong with that? Matthew 12:20 became central about how Jesus treated people. I began to ask, as part of what's on here, how many of my beliefs were cultural rather than biblical. The foundations of my spiritual house were collapsing. Can you put up the next one there, Tamara? I want to talk a little bit about that liminal space. So liminal is it's a Latin word for the space between 2 rooms. Okay, so if I'm standing right here in the midst of this door frame, I'm in the liminal space. I'm in the in-between. I'm not in that room, I'm not in this room, right? So the liminal space is a space of transition between 2 rooms. You don't live in this. You can't. You just can't. So liminal space, to be in a liminal space, is to be in a place of transition. And what I found in the midst of this transitional space was it was lonely. I didn't know, I didn't trust myself. I felt shame for being fooled. I didn't know who I could, since the ones that I had trusted were not faithful, who could I trust? Trust was a big deal. Didn't trust myself, didn't know who to trust. So in this space, it was about 18 months I spent in this liminal space, actually in January 23rd. This last year has been a reconstruction year for me. But in that liminal space, who can I trust? What is true? Can I trust myself again not to be fooled? I know I can't live here. How do I choose to risk to trust? What's my new core foundations? I'm thankful that Jesus walks with us in the midst of that. That he didn't give up on me. I'm thankful for you. When I was telling a friend of mine about this, he said to me, "So how did you pastor?" Well, in the midst of this, I said I had a pretty awesome board. Our lead team was phenomenal. It allowed me to ask uncomfortable questions, not fire me, to give me space to be curious and wonder about things. I thank you, because I did talk about these things over the last few years. Not as fully and complete as this, but so I'm thankful for this space. As a result of this, Cam Robinson and I started a thing called Coffee House Conversations, where we give space for asking questions, for doubt, for curiosity, for uncertainty, for throwing out ideas that we actually don't even believe, but we just want to test them out and see if they're true or not. This very beautiful, safe space that essentially, in many ways, while I was on sabbatical, was my church. And there's friendships there that are very dear. So I'm thankful too for this last year. This has been the time of greatest growth, spiritual growth in my entire life, since the 23rd of January. And God's been so good as I've kind of rebuilt things. And I think it's more solid than it was before. I want to give space. I know this has been could be a little bit intense and a little vulnerable. If you have questions or you want clarity on some things, why do I do this? I've found that any time, I've been here for just about 8 years, okay? This is kind of how Tony works. I've found that when I do something like this, there are so many conversations that come out of it. People will say, you talked publicly about what I've been thinking, or whatever. And it gives freedom to have these conversations. So it's pastoral, actually, what I'm trying to do today.